A letter from the other world has decisive consequences for a grieving husband and devoted sister. Thank you for agreeing to help me with this, Victoria. I don't think I could handle it on my own, but apparently the time has come. You have nothing to apologize for, Frank. I know how hard it is, and it's only been 2 weeks since Jessica. Well, that's not that long. I'm happy to help. Victoria took Frank's hand as they entered the bedroom. It was the master bedroom, but when Jessica's cancer began to worsen, she insisted that Frank move into the guest room so he could sleep without having to listen to her moan all night. They both looked at the bed, almost expecting to see Jessica's frail and pale figure leaning against the pillows. Now there were only fresh sheets. I haven't been able to sleep here since she left. I don't think I'll ever be able to sleep here again, Victoria. She had nothing to say, so she simply squeezed his hand. Come on, Frank, let's get started. Victoria agreed to help him get rid of her sister's things. They reached the third drawer of the dresser when they found a large envelope addressed to both of them. They couldn't open it right away and continued sorting Jessica's clothes. There were now 4 neat stacks. Things Victoria wanted to keep, things Frank wanted to keep, things for the thrift store and things for the landfill. They had no more excuses. A large white A4 envelope lay face down on the mattress. When Victoria turned it over, she felt a trembling, as if someone had walked over her grave. It was the handwriting on the envelope. Jessica wanted to send them a message from the other world. On the neat front of the envelope was written, Frank and Victoria, if you find this while I'm still alive, please don't read it until I'm gone. I love both of you. Jessica. They looked at the envelope and at each other. I'll do it, said Frank, plucking up his courage. He took the penknife out of his pocket, but his hand shook as he prepared to insert it into the valve. Victoria put her hand on his arm to calm him down, and he opened the envelope. Inside were 2 envelopes, one for each of them, and a cover letter. The letter said, Dear Frank and Victoria, thank you for waiting until I left before opening this. Before you read anything else, I want to remind you that you are the most important people in the world to me, and I would never want to hurt you on purpose. But when you read your letters, you will understand that I did. I must tell you the truth, although it will upset you and change your opinion of me. But I don't want to be considered a saint, and I don't want you to waste time before finding happiness. This is the only gift I can give you now. This is the only saving grace in this whole terrible situation. Please read your letters in private before speaking to each other. Victoria, your letter is longer, so Frank will have to wait a little. I love you both and hope you forgive me. Jessica. The sister and husband took their individual envelopes, afraid of their contents. There will be no turning back once they read what Jessica wanted to hide before she left. We don't have to do this, Frank. Victoria trembled and squeezed his hand for support. We won't be able to rest without knowing, Vicky. We won't be able to move on with our lives. Frank placed his large hand on her hand and squeezed it gently. I'll go into the next room. Tell me when you're ready to talk. He took his envelope and left the room. Victoria looked at her envelope. For a while, she thought about just burning it, but over the years, she realized that Jessica wanted to tell her something but couldn't. Perhaps this letter will provide those missing words. She had a feeling the news would be bad, so she breathed slowly, waiting for her anxious feelings to subside. Frank had a different attitude. His career in the military taught him to face his fears in combat and in everything else. He tore the envelope and began to read. Dear Frank, I'm sorry if what you read hurts you. I would like to fix everything and do it differently, but I don't have that opportunity. My gift to you is that you can now follow your heart and find happiness in your remaining days. This whole mess started 8 years ago when you were on your second tour of duty in Iraq. Things are better now, or at least fairer. But there was no PTSD back then, just Gulf War syndrome, as it was called. It was a stigma, a symptom of those who were unfit for war. While soldiers and their families coped with stress, it was the same as they had coped since the Napoleonic Wars. Be silent, drink too much, argue, and be violent towards yourself and those who tried to help. It doesn't justify what I did, but I hope it explains my unhappiness. We were only together for 2 years, and half of that time you were in the service. I was 23 and you were almost 30, and we were still trying to figure out what our life together meant. If you remember, you returned from that second service withdrawn and taciturn. You couldn't show or receive affection. Love for you was just sex, often rough. I was sorry when you left for duty again, but I was also relieved. Sometimes I didn't know what would be worse, receiving the news of your death or your return. As you know, I don't come from an army family and couldn't trust other army wives to support each other. One of them made a dark joke at morning tea, calling themselves widows in waiting. I didn't want to find solace in enduring the situation. I wanted to get away from her, at least for a while, until I knew if you would come back. I was probably the perfect candidate for an affair. Young, naive, isolated, and desperate for happiness. When he showed up, it was an accident, but I didn't put up much resistance. I'm sorry I didn't appreciate us more, but I was depressed. He didn't have to put in much effort. Just a smile makes me laugh and feel interesting and wanted as a person. I think this was the third time we met and had sex. He just appeared on the threshold. I opened the door, and he was standing there. He didn't have to say anything. We just knew. I let him in, and we went upstairs, and that was the beginning. He had many flaws, as I learned later, but in the beginning he was a skillful and caring lover. Like most young women, I romanticized his enthusiasm as a sign of love for me. I couldn't be honest and admit that I enjoyed sex as much as he did. My guilty conscience told me there had to be something more, even if he didn't assume the same thing. I continued to see him after you returned for good, even though I swore I wouldn't. You were a sick, broken, evil man, Frank. You denied the horrors you saw and could not accept help from me or the professionals who were finally beginning to solve these problems. He was my safety valve for working with you. I remember how everything changed. We watched the Panorama program about Gulf War syndrome and how thousands of men like you suffered in silence, and their families suffered too. You didn't say anything that evening, but later that night I woke up and found you weren't in bed. I went downstairs and found you crying in the dark on the couch. You said you couldn't handle it on your own. I replied that you don't have to do this alone. I'm here to share this load with you. I loved you in that moment more than ever before, Frank. This was the day you actually returned from the war. The beginning of you becoming the man I loved and admired for the rest of my life. I finished the novel and thought that was the end. You started therapy and I was there for you, please believe me. But there were tragic circumstances that led to the resumption of the affair against my will. I am ashamed of what happened during that period, but thank God it ended after 2 terrible years. Frank, in all this time, no matter what I did, I never stopped loving you. When it was over and I was free, it was great, but who knew we had so little time? These were the best 4 years of my life. Several times before I got sick, I wanted to tell you everything, confess and throw myself at your mercy. But there are other people we both care about who would be harmed by my selfish desire to clear my conscience. That's why I was silent. Then cancer came, and that changed everything. I didn't have the courage. I couldn't imagine losing my husband and my sister. I should have waited until now to make peace with both of you. You see that I have omitted many details in my confession. This is to spare you unnecessary pain because I hope this will help you find happiness with someone I know you love and respect. Victoria knows the whole story, so I'll leave it up to her to tell you what she tells you. It is my dying hope that you can find each other and enjoy the happiness you both deserve. Don't let any feelings of impropriety hold you back. If your feelings for her are mutual, as I think they will be, then you should do your best not to waste time. You have my full blessing, as much as that can be appreciated. I love both of you. Please be happy now. Jessica. Frank's tears fell onto the page, blurring the ink. He carefully placed the pages on the bed. He thought he should be angry, but what he felt was a deep sense of relief. He had suspected all these years that there was someone else. At the time, his initial reaction was anger and jealousy, but he couldn't confront her about it. He couldn't handle the overwhelming evidence of Jessica's cheating because he was afraid she would leave him. Instead, he fought fire with fire, secretly dating other military wives as if that would even the score. When he felt guilty about their husbands, he turned to the women of easy virtue who crowded around the base. Then he stopped. His breakdown was a turning point. The therapy and support he received showed him how lost he was. Jessica was by his side and took on his anger and confusion. He didn't resent Jessica for temporarily saving him from him. Pressure was the correct description. During the years he was recovering, he hoped it was over and ignored any feelings to the contrary. He was glad that she confirmed that it was over by the time he felt they were on top. She was right. The 4 years before she fell ill were indeed happy years for both of them. Frank read the letter again, this time realizing how carefully Jessica had censored herself to protect someone else. He realized that it was Victoria. What did you do so bad, Jessica? What did you tell Victoria that you want her to decide if I should hear this? His mind raced with possible answers. He was glad that Jessica saw his feelings for Victoria as honest. Her attempt to bring them together with her last breath was a sincere act of devotion. He will ask Victoria. He'll take this chance for himself and Jessica. Frank put Jessica's letter back in the envelope and went downstairs to make a cup of tea. He will wait for a signal from Victoria. He will look forward to the rest of his life and will thank Jessica for the opportunity. Frank's heavy step on the stairs brought Victoria out of her trance. She looked at the clock on the bedside table and realized that she had been sitting in a daze of fear for more than half an hour. She knew that at some point he would return to ask what was in her letter, and that gave her the courage to open it. Victoria's hands were shaking too much to hold the paper, so she placed the pages on the dressing table and sat down in the chair in front of the mirror. The chair Jessica has sat on to do her makeup all these years. Victoria had to sit on her hands to calm them down. Then she took a deep breath and read. Dear Victoria, please remember, no matter what you read, I did not intend to hurt you. If I didn't think that knowing what I was about to say could improve your life, I would take my secret to the grave. My deepest hope is that there will be no false praise of me, and that you will have a happy future with a person I know you love and who admires you. Now that I'm here, it's hard to know where to start, so I guess I'll start at the beginning, just like I've wanted to start this conversation with you so many times over the years. I have always admired and respected you, Victoria, even though you are my little sister. You were the one who had the brains and determination to go into medicine, and when you joined the Navy and put yourself in harm's way to help others, I was so proud of you. I felt inadequate with my secure little job at a building society. I was glad that we had at least one hero in our family, and I was happy that Mom and Dad were delighted. I always told them that I had no problem with them praising you in front of everyone because it was a big deal and I knew they loved us both. It's true, I didn't just say that to make them feel better. When you found yourself on a hospital ship treating wounded servicemen from the same Gulf War that Frank fought in, I felt like we were all connected and that Frank would be okay because you were there to heal him if he got hurt. I know it sounds stupid to think in such simple terms, but it was my way of making sense of it all. Military wives don't see the big picture like politicians want them to. They just want to know that their husbands will come home safe and sound, regardless of the merits of the cause they are fighting for. When Frank returned from the first tour, he did not return intact. I remember when the ship docked, there was a cordon keeping families on the observation platform. The women I stood with nervously passed binoculars to each other. Why are they keeping us so far away? I asked one of the older wives, who looked at me and said, They are doing this so that you can prepare before he sees you, so that you can prepare for what he cannot say in his letters. I heard the woman behind me squeal with joy when she spotted her husband's face in the crowd. Then I heard her groan as the crowd parted, and she saw that his hand bandages and the hand is missing. What should have been a joyful homecoming became tinged with anxiety and fear. I took the binoculars from her and began looking for Frank among the gathering crowd. There he was, all his arms and legs were in place. I burst into tears and thanked God for this. But what I couldn't see through the binoculars was how damaged Frank was inside. Back then, we didn't have the internet where ordinary people could share their experiences. No one openly discussed the stresses and strains of war, and the Department of Defense was quick to silence you if you asked questions. They feared the impact on morale, so these men suffered in silence. Then television started talking about Gulf War syndrome, or as it is now called, post-traumatic stress disorder. The army then disparaged it as something unreal, like the man's flu, something to be pitied rather than acknowledged and treated. Frank became withdrawn, prone to losing his patience with every little thing I said. He wanted to make love, or rather, just have sex constantly, as if to prove that he was still alive. But even in this, he was angry and rude. I asked him to talk to me about things, and he said I wasn't there so I couldn't understand. It sounded like some cliché Vietnam War movie, but it was true. We continued to wander for the next 6 months, and when he said he was coming back for another tour, I received the news with equal parts fear and relief. I am telling you all this, Victoria, so that you understand my state of mind at the moment when the following happened. I never got along with the other army wives. Frank was 30, and I was 23 when we met. Many of his comrades were older than him, veterans of other campaigns, and their wives were older too. I felt inadequate because I couldn't take things as hostilely as they seemed to be able to. At some gathering, one of them made a joke about widows waiting, and the others laughed at this dark humor, but I could not find comfort in it. I needed something outside of army life to help me cope with the pressure. In retrospect, my affair seemed inevitable. A young, frightened army wife, missing love and affection. Easy prey for an experienced seducer. I first met him when he came to fix a faulty central heating. He was a civilian contractor working on the base, renovating dilapidated housing stock. He was only a couple of years older than me and had a sly grin that he knew women liked. He made temporary repairs, then asked for a cup of tea. Here, my dear, another temporary repair until the Department of Defense replaces these ancient machines. I fix old boilers at this base all the time, he said suggestively. You're a cheeky bastard. I'm only 25 and I don't need fixing, thank you very much. It was nice to joke with a man who had nothing to do with the war. Okay, honey, but if anything else comes up, this facility is on my territory. I will handle any problems personally. You can't trust these other cowboys. He gave me his business card. A week later, I reported a leaking faucet. He came and was surprised to see me. I was in a beautiful dress and makeup. I'm leaving soon, I explained. He just smiled because he knew it was for him. He chatted for an hour, pretending to fix something under the sink so he could sit on the floor and look at my feet. The third time he came to fix the noise from the stove. He didn't even make it to the kitchen. This was what I was missing. After that, he showed me his wedding ring, which he kept in his trouser pocket. So it doesn't get caught on something while I'm working, he said. His story was that his wife was a nurse working in Dubai, earning a lot of money. When she returns, they will buy a big house and start a family. I thought it made us equal. We both had something to lose, and we were just giving each other comfort until our loved ones returned. We met outside the base after that, away from nosy neighbors. Most often this was in his cramped apartment or car. Sometimes we would venture outside if we were feeling adventurous. When Frank returned from his third tour, I told him we had to stop. But Frank was even worse than before, and I knew he would explode again. Forgive me, but I couldn't be with him all the time, waiting for this to happen. Only 2 weeks had passed when I called my lover, asking to meet again. I realized by then that this relationship was more than just fun and casual sex for me. I thought he felt the same. How could he spend so much time on me if he didn't care? I knew he enjoyed us dating behind Frank's back, but I could tell he was uncomfortable when I started getting serious about him. When he announced 2 months later that he was being transferred to another base because his team was preparing another Department of Defense facility for military personnel returning from the Gulf, I was sad, but he was relieved. In retrospect, I was glad that circumstances ended the relationship because I didn't have the courage to do it myself. Shortly after he left, a crisis event occurred and Frank completely broke down. This time, professional help was available and families felt part of the solution. I dedicated myself to making Frank a better person. I was glad to play a role in his rehabilitation and grateful that life wasn't complicated by what could have been a messy ending to the affair. You also returned from tour and lived at the base near Portsmouth. I remember how excited I was to see you again and how supportive you were in helping Frank deal with his problems. You said you saw so much of this in the service. I was so happy when you said you started dating someone, but I didn't want to tell you too much for fear of jinxing it. About 6 months later, you both came to visit us. I have replayed this day in my head many times over the years. We have recently moved into new Ministry of Defense housing near Aldershot. You came to our door, and I joyfully greeted you. You couldn't wait to tell me you were engaged, and your fiancé brought us a housewarming gift from the car. We hugged, and I looked over your shoulder and saw him. Then the world stopped. Yes, your fiancé James was the same man I had an affair with for almost 18 months. He looked shocked to see me, then a big smile appeared on his face. He had hidden it by the time you introduced me, but I was speechless from my heartbeat. What a terrible accident. It was almost 2 hours before I could steal a few words with him alone. I said it was a terrible coincidence and begged him not to tell you or Frank anything, and that we should just be polite and stay away from each other. James just laughed and said it was nonsense. It's fate and luck. He joked that he had always wanted two sisters and that maybe we could work something out once we got to know each other better. I was terrified, and then I remembered my wife abroad and threatened that I would expose him if he didn't leave you alone. He laughed. He just made it up so he could have an excuse if the women got too pushy like I did in the end. I realized what a naive fool I was. This didn't bother him. He even took a moment to look around to see if anyone was nearby. When we were together, I asked you how you met James, and your story wasn't much different from mine. He was fixing a radiator in the officer's mess and made the same advances to you. I felt sick and thought we weren't the only ones he was targeting. Remember when I asked if things were going too fast and if you should slow down? I hoped that over time you would see what I did not see, but I couldn't reach you. Be happy for me, Jess. I think he's the one. I tried to be happy for you, Victoria. I really did. I smiled when we met at dinners and family gatherings. I ignored when James tried to hit on me when no one was looking. She laughed and rejected his offers to meet somewhere for quick sex. I hoped he would lose interest over time, but then he became threatening. He said he wondered how Frank would react if he found out what his wife was like while he was away. James said that if he heard such news, it would drive him crazy. Frank was making excellent progress, and he depended on me, just as I wished he had from the beginning. But it would ruin him if James followed through on his threat. Frank would never trust me or anyone else again. It was terrible to realize what kind of person James was behind all those fake smiles and good nature. He took great pleasure in having both of us and was always comparing us, which I didn't want to hear. Vile man, I knew it wouldn't end. I should have found a way to warn you. I remember you called one day and said that we should all get together this weekend. You sounded excited but didn't want to share your news. I couldn't wait any longer. I was determined to tell you about James and I's affair, to beg for your forgiveness, and to beg you not to tell Frank. Not for my sake, but for his sake, as a fragile patient recovering from psychological trauma. I drove to Portsmouth that rainy day to confess, but before I could tell my story, you told me your news. You were pregnant. We hugged and I congratulated you. You asked about my news. I couldn't say anything then. I had to pretend that I couldn't wait until the weekend to hear your news. You were so excited that you believed my weak excuse. You couldn't take the bad news after what you just told me. I had to wait and hope that everything would be fine during this time. I saw only one way out of this terrible situation. I had to sacrifice myself for Frank's peace of mind and your safety. At least that's how I rationalized it. I didn't want James to be with another woman and bring God knows what diseases to you and your unborn child. Besides, I couldn't imagine Frank suffering again after everything he'd already been through. So I started seeing James again, I'm ashamed to admit, behind your and Frank's backs. But it didn't last long. He took me to secluded forest places. I was always afraid that someone might come. I know the birth of your first child, Ellie, was very painful. You had a lot of stitches, and you weren't able to be intimate with James for a long time. I think that's why he demanded that we meet more often. He took me to an apartment that he said was rented by a friend of his. The place looked empty, and James took me into the bedroom and showed me some things he wanted me to wear. He asked me to come to the living room when I was ready. I don't know when I got the feeling that we weren't alone, but I looked up and saw through the open kitchen door that someone was filming us. I realized that he arranged this to make his own film. "Didn't I say she was a natural?" James said to the operator, who came out of his hiding spot. I cried bitterly over how I had let it all get this far. I felt shame at being used and humiliated in this way. When I came out of the bathroom, they were laughing and drinking tea. I said I don't want to go back there anymore. James said that it was only a test video and that we would make more unless I wanted him to send a copy of what we just made to Frank. He said they would edit it so that James could not be identified and another man, Harry, would comment. It was just blackmail from then on. Any feeling James had for me, he lost in his pursuit of more perverse pleasures. I'm sorry that we went back there again and made other films, with both men at the same time, and then with another woman. I was cursed for an illicit affair and felt that it cursed my soul. I even thought about suicide as a way out, but was too cowardly to do it. I said to myself, how will Frank survive without me? This terrible situation continued for another year, by which time Frank had almost recovered and you were expecting your second child, Nancy. It was hard being your sister and your friend, Victoria, knowing all the terrible things I did. I hope you understand that I didn't do this to hurt you. I convinced myself that someone else was doing it, that there was a good person inside me who could come back if given the chance. But I didn't see where this chance could come from. Then one day a miracle happened, and what had been a terrible tragedy also became my salvation. One July day, a police car arrived at my door, and the policewoman asked if I was related to James Mulhern. I said yes, but why didn't they contact his wife? They just asked me to go with them. We arrived at Farnborough Hospital, where I was told that James was seriously injured and in a coma after a car accident. They took me to the intensive care unit, and I saw him, the mask on his disfigured face, and the respirator rose and fell. There was also a huge cage around his body, keeping the blankets away from him. They then asked me if I could identify the deceased passenger in his car. My heart almost stopped because I thought it was you. I walked into the identification room at the morgue and held my breath as they opened the curtains. I have never felt such relief in my life when I saw that it wasn't you. They pulled back the sheet, and I saw a young woman on the table. She was about the same age as me when I started dating James, and I realized that my efforts to protect others from James were not successful. He was doing the same thing with someone's wife, girlfriend, or daughter. Now she lay dead because of him. I looked at her shoes and stockings with garters and realized where they were. I was furious. I wanted to destroy everything, destroy it all. I saw my chance. I don't know her, but I think he was having an affair, I suggested to the police officer. Why do you think so? Asked the female detective who joined us. Well, please don't tell my sister, but he made indecent proposals to me several times. There is evidence that this young woman recently had sex, the detective confirmed. Perhaps you should check the match with James. She nodded and made a note in her book. A couple of days later, I drove past the apartment where they were filming films, and then to the intersection with the main road and noticed an information board about the incident, begging witnesses. I anonymously reported that I saw two people arguing outside an apartment and getting into a car, which then crashed into the road. The police raided the apartment and arrested the man who took the video, but could not prove anything because James, and he kept the tapes elsewhere. I scared him enough that he left the apartment and never came back, hoping that by doing this, I had saved other women from his attention. You were on some kind of secret training about how to deal with gas attacks, and that's why they couldn't contact you on the day of James' accident. I know you may hate me for this, Victoria, but I consider what happened to James to be God's help. I remember the two of us sitting next to the intensive care unit for 2 days and nights until James regained consciousness. I prayed for him to die, and you prayed for his life. The doctors ran tests before they allowed us to see him. I'm guessing you knew what they were looking for, but you didn't want to scare me. When they came out and said James was paralyzed from the waist down, our reactions couldn't have been more different. As his wife, unaware of all his other affairs, you burst into tears of genuine love and sadness. I pretended to be shocked because inside I was jubilant. I'm ashamed, but I gloated about his injury. My torment is over. His hold over me was broken, and he would never terrorize me or any other woman again. But then I realized that his enslavement of me was replaced by his enslavement of you, because now he needed your care for the rest of his life. I knew you wouldn't leave him, and I couldn't tell you, not then. This evil and unworthy man would receive the love and attention of his unsuspecting wife. I was so sorry that it would have kept you with him for the rest of his life. While you went to tell Mom and Dad the news that he was still alive, I stayed in the room with him. She leaned over him and said that the young girl was dead, and that soon he would wish that he too would die in that car with her. I was the first to tell him that he was paralyzed from the waist down. I told him I would do everything I could to convince you to put him in a nursing home and leave him there to rot. She said that I would tell you about our novel, not the first one. She said that he took the photos to blackmail me for further meetings. James said you won't believe me, then remembered that I had asked for some photos as souvenirs of our adventures. He never thought that I could use them against him, so he willingly gave them to me. But now he has provided his own evidence to support my story. She asked if he wanted to talk to Frank about what it was like to have two sisters at the same time. James started crying, but I continued to throw every painful thing at him. I was out of breath by the end. Finally, I asked him what it was like to be blackmailed and intimidated like he did to me. He recoiled from my anger and the hatred in my eyes. He even apologized insincerely for all this. He said that he just got carried away and would never carry out his threats. I didn't believe him, and he knew it. But I offered him a deal for the sake of you and the children. I said as long as he doesn't be a jerk to you during his rehab, I'll leave him alone. I kept my word longer than he did, because in less than 6 months James was making your life hell again, Victoria. You were struggling with 2 small children and the pressure of being the sole breadwinner. Doctors found traces of a controlled substance when he was brought in after the accident, which violated the terms of his insurance. There was no payment for the accident. In addition, a criminal case was opened on charges of manslaughter for the death of his young passenger. I nearly jumped up in court when the judge acquitted him for lack of evidence, saying it would be wrong to separate James from his family after such severe injuries. What about that poor girl's family? You'd be better off in prison without him. He brought all this horror on you and did not help. I saw how you fought to get through it all, and I knew I couldn't let you suffer anymore, so I did something. James has always had a very high sexual appetite. I'm sure you suspected that he was getting his needs met elsewhere, especially when you were pregnant. I'm ashamed to admit, but I was the source of his satisfaction. Either way, without the ability to have sex now, I knew James would think life wasn't worth living. He didn't care how you and the children felt. If he couldn't satisfy himself, nothing else mattered. That's why I provoked him. But I never let him touch me ever. There was no reward for him. He was dead, lifeless, and this realization made him cry. But my heart was hard, and my revenge had to be as cruel as his exploitation of me. I saw the pitiful look in his eyes and made suggestions. If you want to leave to finish everything, James, I can help you. I can do it painlessly. I was like a drop of water on a stone every day. I only hoped he would give in before you cracked under the pressure of trying to keep everything in order. One day, he asked me to bring him some strong pills. I still had the ones left over from when Frank was heavily medicated, and I had to keep an eye on them to make sure he didn't do something stupid. But I thought it would come back to me, or worse, to you, since you're a nurse. So I bought paracetamol, many different brands, and gave him packets of some of the pills I had missed. I wanted to pretend that he had been collecting them for some time. In addition, I bought another bottle of whiskey, which we gave him for his birthday, since there was some left in the first one. He could have hidden this bottle to do this, but he spent weeks gathering the courage to do the right thing. Then you collapsed at work with a dangerous stomach ulcer, and they kept you in the hospital for 48 hours for observation. I took your kids over for the night and saw them feel guilty and grateful for not spending time with James. He became a toxic person and was poisoning you all. I couldn't watch you suffer anymore. I went to your house in the evening and gave James an ultimatum. I asked if he wanted to see you dead and your children orphans. Threatened that since Frank and I were the children's godparents, we would do everything possible to make sure he never saw them again. She said that if there was even a drop of humanity left in him, he must die so that you could live. He had to find his courage before you returned from the hospital. I put the bag of whiskey on his table and left. The next morning, I went to your house before picking you up from the hospital, under the pretext of bringing fresh clothes. I found James dead in his chair. He left a note, a few incoherent lines that explained little and did not contain a drop of remorse. So I took it. I called the police and reported his death. Told 2 officers that James had been depressed for a long time. They put together the evidence I left behind. When they said it looked like he'd been collecting the pills for a while, I couldn't help but smile. I told them that I often felt that my bag had been touched when I came into the house. Perhaps he took some from me. They called the coroner, who took James' body. After that, I went to the hospital and told them what happened to James. Your doctors agreed to keep you for a couple more days under some pretext. I went home and Frank, and I told your kids what James did to spare you the pain of having to deal with this. Victoria, I'm in no position to judge anyone given what I've done, but when I saw the mixed look of grief and relief on your face when I told you the news about James, I knew I did the right thing for everyone. The years after James' death were some of the happiest in my life, and I think in yours and Ellie's and Nancy's lives too. For me, it was all worth it. Although I am not religious, I believe that murder is a mortal sin and must be paid for. So when these small tumors that I had ignored for a while turned out to be the beginning of lymph node cancer, I knew that this debt was being collected. I can never thank you and Frank enough for how devotedly you cared for me during the time I was dying. Your care was tireless. Frank thought he could save me by force of will. You saved my life when I came back broken, honey. I said it was different and the body wasn't so easy to fix, but when I went into remission, I had to believe in the power of faith. They gave me another year, for which I am very grateful. It was another year to see your friendship and love with Frank flourish. I will finish this letter now, Victoria. Once again, I apologize for everything that happened between me and James. Fate was not kind to both of us. I hope one day you'll understand that I did the right thing by making James leave. I truly believe he had to die so you could live. I hope you and Frank don't waste any time and do something with the obvious love you have for each other. Me and James were broken. I wish you two all the best we never had. I love you, my dear sister Victoria. Goodbye. Jessica. Victoria dropped the letter and burst into tears. She cried with anger and sadness, relief and love for her sister. James put Jessica in an impossible position, and she sacrificed herself more than once to keep Victoria and Frank safe. The candid description of sex with James did not shock Victoria. She had always suspected that James had never been satisfied in their marital bed, and had accepted the fact that she did not know how he satisfied his desires. Victoria understood that her unconscious complicity and failure to confront him added to Jessica's suffering, and for this she bitterly regretted. The poor young woman who died in the accident was indisputable proof of James's infidelity. Victoria believed James' explanation that it was a prostitute he had picked up, and that she had caused the accident by snatching his wallet in an argument over money. But deep down Victoria knew that this was not true. Oh, Jessica, if only you could tell me. If only you could find a way to make me understand, Victoria said out loud. But in the early days, James had been charming to her, just as he had been when he seduced Jessica, and Victoria knew she wouldn't believe anything against him. Victoria heard a soft knock on the door, which became louder. She didn't know how long Frank stood outside the door. Come in, Frank. I'm sure you need a cup of tea now. He placed the floating mug on the dressing table and noticed the large number of pages in Jessica's letter to her sister. They looked at each other and hugged, trying to support each other through the whirlwind of emotions that their letters caused. Frank put his hand on Victoria's cheek and wiped away a tear with his thumb. "You were crying too," she noted, seeing his reddened eyes. "Jessica didn't want to hurt us." "I know, Victoria. She didn't go into detail, didn't even say his name. I think she told you more." "Yes, she did, and she left it up to me what to tell you because she wants us to be happy together. Let me tell you something first, Victoria. I love you and admire you for a long time. Seeing how you dealt with the kids after James died, and how you were there for Jessica until the very end. I love you for your devotion, just as I loved Jessica for hers. No matter what she did to deal with me at my worst. It would have been wrong to do anything earlier because Jessica was my wife despite the past. But now all this is in the past, and I will follow her advice. I will not miss this opportunity because of some stupid idea of what is right. So no matter what happens, no matter what horrors I have to know, tell me first, we have a chance, can we be happy?" Victoria hugged him, then pulled away and looked at his smiling face. She kissed him as she had wanted to do many times before. Her hand got tangled in his curly hair. "Yes, we have a chance, Frank. We have an opportunity, and for you, me and Jessica, I intend to do everything possible." "Oh my God, Victoria," Frank kissed her, and their tears mixed. "Before we go any further, Frank, I need to read you Jessica's letter, that's all. And you must forgive her, just as I forgive her." Frank took her hand, drawing strength from Victoria to face what he knew would be an unpleasant hearing. He smiled at her, and she smiled back. "Okay, Victoria, read to me what Jessica wrote." Subscribe to our channel so that your love doesn't cheat on you, and go ahead and listen to the next story, because this story is nothing compared to the next one. If you're under 18, don't even think click to the next one. Click to the next one. Click to the next